So this is how our previous file structure looked like, where we had docker compose, main, and git ignore in the main directory that we were working from. Now, as we build our project, we are going to be rearranging some of these files into folders and so on. So that is where we're going to start today. So I want you to come into the main application directory that you have, or the main project directory, and create a new directory called as app or app. And this is where all our test files and the application files, everything goes into. And we are going to keep the base directory or the root directory to Docker Compose and Docker files and readmes and requirements, etc. So we're not going to be putting any of our application files here. So all the application files are in this app folder. So let's go ahead and move the main.py file that we had in the root directory into the app directory. So once you do have the main.py in here, this is how it's going to look like. Next, we are going to create another folder within this app directory called as tests. So this is where all of our test files are going to live, and any other folders in this application directory is going to be the main application, but anything that's in the test folder is going to be the test. You'll see what tests actually mean next, but let's create this folder. And we also create this underscore init underscore dot py file, and this defines this application directory as a module. Now, in the previous section where we were going through these modules where you can import modules and so on, this is what we mean. So you can import anything from this directory in any other file. And to make this a module, we initialize it with underscore init underscore dot py file. And this is just an empty file. Nothing goes in here. It's just to define that this app directory is actually a module. So let's see what we had here in the main.py file. In our main API, we just had one route, which is the base or the root route, and it was just returning a hello world. Now this is not really useful for us, so let's create another route, which is going to be a status. So anytime you type in your URL /status, we want it to return an OK message. And there are certain use cases for this route, like if you want to check if your API is up and running well in the cloud on GCP or AWS or any other cloud platform you're hosting your application on, you can use this so that you don't have to wait for heavy API calls. You can just have this always ping this /status, and it returns the status of your application as okay. If it doesn't return, then that means the application has obviously crashed. So let's create that. So we're going to start with this app.get /status. Now this app is where we've defined app, which is a variable which holds the fastApi, which is another class, which has got a title called University API. Now that was quite a lot. So fastApi, which is the API library that we're using, has bundled up so many functions into their module and released it to public like us, open source. So we can go in and import this and use it in our application, and we don't have to build all the things that they've built for us. So we've initialized this fastApi into a variable called app. And in our case, we are going to use this app.get, and we're going to define it a route. So this can be /status or username, whatever you want it to be. But in our case, because we want the status of our API, we are going to call this /status. Now, there are other things like instead of get, you can also define a post and patch and update and all these things. So if I just do post, you can define post or patch, etc. And we'll get through all these API calls in a moment when we start building our application. But in the first case, we just want to do a get request because we were getting the status of our application. So next step, like we see here, we want to define a function, right? So this is how we define a function, where we give it a name. And we also see this async. We'll come back to this in a moment, but we give it a function which we saw in the previous video by just calling it a def, and then give the name of the function and then put double colon at the end of that function. Async is nothing but it's an asynchronous operation, and we don't have to worry about that yet. We'll get to this in a future section. So we'll leave that as it is. It's another keyword which is reserved within Python. Now, finally, what we can do is we'll call return, and we are going to give this dictionary. So if you remember from the intro that we had, this is a dictionary where we have a message and we say the message is okay. And within Python, one of the things which is different from other programming languages is you need to define indentation over here. So if you do this, that is an error. So what I generally do is I come into the line which I was at, and if I just press enter, because it is a .py file, VS Code usually puts them within an indentation. So this is how it should be. And if you do put it here, you'll see an error over here. It says expected indented block, so you should be able to fix that. So this is our function now. So we have a status, and if you run this API, we should be able to call status and get a message okay. So we can run this API, can't we? So we are going to call UV icon, and similar to what we did in the first video, we're going to just run this. You don't have to keep the Docker Compose up at this point. So now if I press enter, we are actually getting an error because it says could not import module main. And that is because we've moved our directory structure or refactored some of these things, and now it is in a folder called app. So what we need to do is push this in app.main, and then the main directory, main application is here. And if I now press enter, now the app should be up and running in the location which is 127.0.0.0, which is our local host. So if I come into my browser again, just localhost 8000:8000 should give us this. But if I put a /status, we should get message equals okay. So this is what we're looking for. This is an API that we've coded. So hopefully now you understand how to go about writing this API endpoint. Now the next thing is, it can get really complicated really easily when you're trying to build these APIs, and a lot of people are working on this. So a way to get around this is to have good documentation in your team. But usually what happens is people prefer to write good test, and they follow test-driven development method, where these tests kind of act as documentation. So if you follow the code within the test, it's kind of self-explanatory as to what exactly this application does. So you don't have to go through a ton of text to understand this application. So that is an approach that we are going to take as well, because you might find really good videos online of people doing Python programming. But when you're putting something like this together, you really want this to be future proof. You really want to think like how a lead programmer would look like and give you reviews on what code you're writing. So generally what they prefer is to have test cases for all of this. And that is where we're going to start, so that you are set up for a good foundation over here. So we've already created a folder called test. Now if I open this up, you'll see a few files that I've already created, and these are all really simple files again. So we need to put this init file again, which is similar to what we did over here. It is an empty file. It just defines that the test what we've defined here. Folder is a module that we can import from and export from and so on. And we also have this pytest.ini. Don't worry about the extensions just yet, but what we are really doing with this pytest.ini is initializing some of our environment variables. Now, what are an environment variables? So imagine now we are running this in Python environment, and you need access to the database name, the database password, and so on. It's much easier to just come in where we are calling all these APIs and then hard code or define a variable like this and put a password in here. But that's a really bad practice. So that's why we are putting all this in an environment file. Again, at this stage, it's not necessary to learn all this because we're not testing against the database yet. But just put this in here so that it will be useful when we do get to this section. So let's create a new file on your machine called test_main.py. And if you open it up, it's obviously empty. So we are going to import a few modules and write our first test and then test against this. So the first module that we're going to import is called Pytest. And there is a requirements file here as well, which I'm going to give you. And this contains all the modules that our project needs. Again, similar to the module like import OS that we did in the previous video, Pytest is another module. So it's very similar to this fastApi as well, which is another module. So Pytest is a testing framework that we are going to be using. And if you haven't installed this on your machine, this will throw up an error. So a simple way to do this is pip install Pytest, and this should solve your problem. But we'll go and look at what requirements.txt has and how you can go over all these errors that you're going to face, especially when we are importing some of these modules which are not installed by you at this point. So the next import that we're going to do is from fastApi. There is a test client as well. We're going to import that test client. You'll see where this is used in a moment. and then we are going to import a random number, random integer function as well. So all this does is it returns a random number between the ranges of number that you define. You'll see where we're going to use this. Next, we are going to import app.main, which is this file that we have here, because we want to test this API route without ever going to the browser. So we are kind of doing some automation over here. So this is really good, because if you have hundreds of APIs, you can't go in and look at each API to see if it's working or if it's not. So we are going to import our app.main and import the module. Next, we are going to do a few fixtures. So pytest.fixture scope equals module. Again, these are all from documentation, so don't worry about trying to understand all this yet. We're going to define a client. So this is the client which runs our server, and we call it with test client and give it our app, and we are also called yield C. Now, some of these functions like with and yield and other things, it's really good to understand, but not at this stage. So when we get to intermediate or advanced stage, you can understand all these things and why we are doing this. But just think of this function as the automation spinning up a server and giving you access to your application. Because if you remember, what we did was, if we did Control J, we still have this server running, right? So I can close this by pressing Control C. Now it is shut down. So every time you run this test, what this application does is it goes and spins up a server like this in the background. So you don't have access to it, but the test has. And then it's going to run all your tests against this application. So that is why we need this test client. So next we'll start defining our test. So I usually like to give a very descriptive and long name, because it's kind of acting as a documentation. So if your team member comes and looks at this test, they should be able to read what this test is all about. So here I've written test when app running status endpoint should return okay. So test dot underscore is kind of like a prerequisite for Python. So anything with test underscore, it treats as a test within these test files. So we are defining this is a test function that we want to test. So next I've said when app running status endpoint, which is the endpoint we're calling, it should return okay. So you can name this whatever you want, but I like to be descriptive, and regardless of it being a long name, I still prefer to have something like this rather than just a test underscore some name which doesn't describe what it's doing. So to that, we are passing this client, which we defined over here. Now, what we want to do is we want to do a client.get, which is also the get function over here. So we are doing similar to what we would do in a browser, but instead of going into the browser and pressing enter, we are calling client.get the endpoint that we specify, and it will be stored in this variable called response. Next, what we want to do is something called an assert. So you'll see a lot of these asserts and other things when you're looking at a test file. So what we are actually doing here is we are saying response.status code should be 200. So when we say assert, we are saying check if this value is true. If not, then this task has failed, or in this case, this test has failed. So we are just asserting that the status code is 200. Now you might ask, why 200? So when you're defining APIs, there are some predefined HTTP request code or status codes, and 200 is one of those, which means it's a successful request. Now there are codes like 400, 500, etc., which we don't have to worry yet, but just remember that 200 is a successful request. Now we just don't want to look at 200, we actually want to look at the data that this endpoint sent, because remember, we are sending message as okay. So we want to put that into a separate variable over here. We are calling response.json, and JSON is because we are sending a JSON or a dictionary response. And then we can assert again, saying if the data has a variable or a key called message, and if that key has a value of okay, then this should be pass, otherwise it's fail. Right, so this is our automated testing that we have, and whenever anyone in your team comes in and looks at this, they can immediately know that we are calling the endpoint status, and we want to get a successful response. And what is that response that we're getting? We are getting a message, and we are getting a value for that key called okay. So this is very, very self-descriptive as to what this application is doing at this. Now, another exercise for you is to test out this route. So because we haven't tested this out, so there is another endpoint over here. So this would be, instead of status, if you just call it /, and then instead of message, if you say it as hello, and if you assert, we are getting the value world over here, then you've written your own test for your API endpoint. So how to go about running this test? So if I come into the documentation, Pytest, you can come into Pytest or search for Google for Pytest. There are simple examples over here. Now, a way to execute these tests is to just type in Pytest in your terminal. So I'm going to open up my terminal. Now, remember, I haven't run the server yet, so I'm not running the UICon command or the Docker Compose. So we are just barely doing the bare minimum of testing this endpoint. So if I come in here and just type Pytest and press enter, you'll see that we have one passed and then the time it took. And then it's saying it collected one item or one test from this folder app test.main. And because we've also prefixed with test underscore, it knew that this was a test. So now we have a passing test, but let's imagine our endpoint was actually, we are not expecting okay, but we are expecting not okay. So imagine this was our case, but in our endpoint, in our code, we're actually returning okay. So what happens now? So if I come in here and do a Pytest again, we'll see that it's actually failed, and it's saying you're getting not okay, but you're expecting okay in your assertion. So it says assertion error, assert okay equals not okay, right? So here is where you would start. So you would start with a failing test and then move towards writing a passing test by building your API. So that's the approach that we're going to take next as well. So hopefully hopefully I've given you enough information on how testing works. And I encourage you, wherever you're doing coding or programming, always start with test. Now, there might be instances where you might not be able to run test, but there are various scenarios where you can test edge cases using unit test or test the entire edge case end-to-end with an end-to-end test, etc. So again, let me just go back to Pytest again and have a one passed test. And let's also commit this. So if I do git status, I get 3 files. Oh, we didn't talk about requirements.txt, right? So if I want to look at all the libraries that I've already installed in my virtual environment, I can do pip freeze, and doing this pip freeze is going to give me a few outputs. So if I look at this, when I do pip freeze, I'll see that these are all the libraries that I have installed in my virtual machine. And this is what the code that you want to commit to the GitHub as well, because if someone else gets hold of your code and they want to run your code, they want to get all this information, like what is the fastApi library or the Pytest library, what version are we using, etc. So pip freeze actually does that for you, and then it creates this list. And the usual convention is to put that into a file called requirements.txt, like over here. So you'll see all this is exactly the same as this. So a way to get that into file is pip freeze greater than, and then type in requirements.txt, and if I just press enter, you'll see that this was updated with all the libraries. Now I'm going to give you this file. So when you want to install from this file, you just say pip install -r and then requirements.txt. So instead of going in and installing by pip install every time, so you can just do pip install once if you have requirements.txt, and all these libraries are going to get installed into your virtual environment that you're working in. So that's good. So let me come back to git status, and we want to see that, okay, we have a deleted main file, but we didn't delete it, we just moved it from the root to the app directory now. So we have an app directory, intro.py is there, and requirements.txt is there. So I'm happy with what I've done so far. So I'm going to say git add and then dot, which is going to add all these files. So if I do git status again, you'll see everything is green. And what I can do is I can do a git commit. So I'm going to call this added test for / status endpoint. So I've committed all this now, and I can easily come in here and say git push origin master, and this should be committed into my GitHub repo now. And if I come into my Explorer, so you'll see there's one more commit. So if I come into my University API TUT GitHub repo, you'll see there was a latest commit where I've just added this app, and you'll see that the last commit date was now. So hopefully that's given you a good understanding of how to write tests and how to start with an API. In the next section, we're going to build on top of this. We'll use Postgres because we want to use build this a university API where students can enroll to courses and and we should be able to read and write from these databases.